Good morning. Today is Tuesday, June 4th, 2024. There is a pervasive idea. You will see it, you will read it, you will hear it, and perhaps you even believe it. It is ubiquitous, and it is wrong. I'm referring to the idea that in Jewish law, when a couple marries, the husband acquires his wife. The wife is an acquisition of the husband. It is not true. So no matter how many times you hear it, or from whom you hear it, or how many times you read it in translation, which you will, it is false. There is no sense in any classic Jewish law source that a husband acquires a wife or that she is somehow his possession. None, nowhere, no way. But there is a reason so many people make this mistake. So I want to look with you together at the source of the mistake, why it is wrong, which comes from the Book of Ruth, which we read on Shavuot, and why it is misleading such that so many people make this mistake. And I plan to do this with you in two parts. Part one today, and then hopefully, with God's help, part two this coming Thursday. Let's start with the Talmud. The Gemara says in Masechta Kiddushin, the tractate that deals with marriage, the Talmud says that marriage is affected by a man, a Jewish man, giving an object of value, like a ring, but it could be anything, and a woman, a Jewish woman, accepting it. That action, properly witnessed, creates the marriage status. The Talmud says, how do we know? What is the source of this procedure? The source is from Sedei Ephron. When Sarah died, we learn in the Parsha Chayesara in Bereishit in Genesis, when Sarah, our matriarch, died, Avraham needed a burial place for her. And Avraham purchased from Ephron a field in Hebron, in the southern part of Israel. And the word that is used in the Torah to describe this is ha'aretz asher kana Avraham. The land, the piece of land, there was also a cave there, but the piece of land, asher kana Avraham. Now that's translated as the field, the land, that Avraham purchased, kana, kuf nun he, that Avraham purchased. And that, says the Talmud, is the model for our marriage ceremony. Now, it is true that the meaning in the context of that verse is to acquire. In that case, Avraham was purchasing, acquiring a field in order to use it as a burial place for Sarah. So that is a correct translation in that context. But the word kana means kinyan. A kinyan is an action. And to translate it as acquire is an imprecise translation. It fits in that context, but it is not the accurate and precise translation of that word. So let's see what the word kana or kinyan really means. And we find this in the Book of Ruth, Sefer Ruth, near the end of the story. So just very briefly, Naomi and her family leave Bethlehem at a time of famine, and they go to across the Jordan to Moab. There, the rest of Naomi's family dies, but her son had already married a woman named Ruth. She converted to Judaism, and she becomes the model for conversion to Judaism. They come back, these two women. Ruth was Naomi's daughter-in-law, but Ruth's husband, Naomi's son, had died. They come back to their city. They had left rich and aristocratic, and they come back poor and humiliated. And they are able to find help from a relative named Boaz. Boaz is a cousin of Naomi's husband who had died. So, after Boaz and Ruth meet, Ruth, at Naomi's suggestion, asks Boaz for two favors, two very big favors. And Boaz is willing to agree to the two requests that Ruth makes. Number one, Boaz will redeem Naomi's fields, which had been sold to satisfy creditors in her absence, and return those fields to her possession so that she will be able to support herself, to get herself out of poverty. That's number one. And number two, he agrees to marry Ruth. But, he says to her, his uncle, who is called Ploni, has the first opportunity to redeem the fields because he is a closer relative than Boaz is. So, the next morning, Boaz finds Ploni. He gathers 10 men to act as witnesses to what is about to happen. Ruth is not present at this moment. And the first subject between Boaz and Ploni is the fields that belong to Naomi. And the Goel, the Redeemer, will purchase from the current owners and return them to the ownership of Naomi again so that she will be able to support herself. And so he says to Ploni, Boaz says to Ploni, do you want to be the Goel? Do you want to be the Redeemer? To do this mitzvah, to spend this money, to buy back the fields, to return them to the possession of Naomi? It's a tremendous mitzvah, costs a lot of money. And Boaz says to Ploni, you have the right of first refusal to do this wonderful mitzvah. And Boaz says to Ploni, if you agree to redeem the fields, then kana neged hayoshvim. Kana, that same word from Bereishit, where we translate it as Abraham acquiring a field, the same word, kuf nun hey, neged hayoshvim, make a kinyan in front of these 10 witnesses. Now, what does it mean here? In this context, the word kana cannot mean to acquire, because if it were to mean that with this action, Ploni is going to acquire the fields, it makes no sense. Because the owners of the fields are not there. No one is buying anything at that moment. Kana, a kinyan, must mean something else, even though every translation will say acquire. It is obviously wrong. Then Boaz says to Ploni, if you buy back the fields, if you redeem the fields to return them to Naomi, you also rus kanisa, the same word, kinyan, to Ruth. Now, that refers to marriage. In other words, he's saying to Ploni, if you agree to redeem the fields, you also agree to marry Ruth. But he uses the same word, Ruth, rus, kanisa, the same word, kinyan, and it refers to marriage. But Ruth is not even there. They're only talking about who is going to have the opportunity to marry Ruth. What does the word kinyan mean? So Ploni says to Boaz, no, thank you. I'm not willing to marry Ruth, and therefore I will also forego the opportunity to redeem the fields. I leave it both to you. I leave both to you. And then we have the pasuk, the verse that explains the whole thing. Referring to this word kinyan, which is so hard to translate, the next verse says as follows. V'zos lifnim b'Yisrael. This had already been established within Israel. This was established law that everybody knows. Al ha'geula, concerning a purchase. V'al ha'temura, and concerning an exchange. L'kayem kol davar, to establish an obligation. You do a kinyan. In other words, a kinyan is an action that affects either a purchase or an exchange or a commitment. And the meaning depends on the context. Sometimes it means purchase, like in the case of Avraham purchasing a field in which to bury Sarah. Sometimes it means creating a commitment. And that's what it means in the Book of Ruth. Boaz is saying to Ploni, I want you to make, if you agree, I want you to make a kinyan, to accept upon yourself the commitment that you are going to buy back the fields. And I want you to accept upon yourself with a kinyan the promise, the commitment that you are going to marry Ruth. And Ploni declines, but that's the meaning of the word. How does one word mean these two separate ideas? So the word kinyan means an action to effect a change in status. That's what it actually precisely means. An action to effect a change in status. It could be a change in status, such as the change in ownership. That's what it means with Avraham buying the field. Or it could be a change in status, such as accepting a commitment on oneself that creates a marriage bond, or to do some other mitzvah, like it means in the context of the Book of Ruth. So Boaz says to Ploni, if you choose to buy back the fields for Naomi, now, in the presence of these witnesses, commit yourself to doing that in the future with an action called a kinyan. And that is what a man and a woman are doing under the chuppah. They are both participating in a kinyan, giving and accepting the ring. And that creates commitment to marriage and changes their status from two single individuals into one married couple. So the next question is, why should the marriage ceremony use this model that is so open to misunderstanding? And how does that relate to the holiday of Shavuos? I hope to share that with you this coming Thursday. But meanwhile, the next time you go to a Jewish wedding, hopefully you will now have a better understanding of what it is that is happening up there underneath the chuppah. My friends, I wish you a great day, and I look forward to seeing you soon in person.